So welcome everybody, my name is Paul Smyers. I'm a practicing real estate agent in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And this is the second in a two-part series I have about low-cost housing. As we all know, housing is a very big part of our budget these days, a huge part, and it's so vitally important. And yet we have a lot of problems with the different costs of housing and so on. And a lot of people in the real estate business, as agents, we get asked about, the first-time buyers. They want to buy a basic house or want to live very simply. And a lot of the younger people, some of them are very rustic and they want a cabin or something, and they want to know how can they get some real basic housing or some kind of a shelter and legally have it on a piece of land. Now, I mentioned that you got to have the right zoning, because in the agriculture area, you have a lot of freedom with your zoning and what you can do with the land. But it's very specific sometimes. If you buy a piece of property, you want to make sure the deed and all the zoning is correct for it. But generally speaking, in a rural area, most parts of this country, there's a lot of open zoning, relatively open zoning, and you can put some various kinds of things there. So I want to suggest a few things here. I haven't tried all these things by any means, but these are things I've researched and looked into it myself a little bit, and talked to people who are involved in some of these projects. Like, for example, yurts. I mentioned that in the previous one. A yurt is a dome type of structure that comes in 18 or 30 feet or various sizes, 24 feet diameter. And it's what they call a temporary structure as far as the real estate is concerned, so it's taxless. And generally speaking, people have made yurts into some very, very long-term situations. They use them on ski slopes and in areas where you get a lot of wind, because they make a great Airbnb kind of place, and they're actually quite comfortable inside. I've been into them on a few occasions. Along with that is tents. There's a lot of different kinds of tents out there. If you look online, you'll see some of these Airbnbs out in rural recreational areas. Some of them are very expensive, unusual tents, big ones, and really beautifully set up and everything. Now, there are people who lived like that. Of course, people have lived in teepees. I've even met people who lived in a teepee when they were younger. So a teepee can be a very useful residence. And again, the zoning, if you have the right kind of zoning, and as long as you don't cause a big scene in the area, typically you can have like one of these structures, such as a yurt or a teepee or something along those lines. Now, another one I mentioned was the tiny homes. That's a very popular thing. Look up tiny homes. It's kind of a fad now, and there's a lot of different people making them, and some of them are pretty or rather large. But campers, parking a camper, an RV, that happens a lot in the rural areas. You see someone's home, and they have the right zoning so that sometimes their relatives come and they stay in a big RV on the property, and it's no problem. Or sometimes you see a rather large RV parked there for a year. I mean, people use it as a guest residence, or sometimes they live full time in some of those things. Basically, the materials that your home is made of makes a difference in how expensive it is to maintain. I mean, you think about a log home that will stand there for 200 years. You can make something out of logs, and it'll last a long time. So there's a lot of different alternatives. So I'll go through a couple more here. Outhouses, I had to mention them because, if you're going to be on the land and you're going to stay there any length of time, you're going to need a little something like that. And then people make huts and bushcraft kind of stuff. There's a lot of interesting things that people have come up with. If you look at bushcrafting on YouTube, you'll find all kinds of interesting huts. And you travel around the world, you'll see all kinds of different constructions. People use slate for roofs, or if you want to build something that lasts a long time, build it out of rocks, and people build little cabins out of rocks, and sometimes very large rocks and so on. So there's a lot of creative things you can do, actually, if you don't mind a little rusticness. But there's also more comfortable kind of situation, like I said, where if you get a tiny home that's a little more elaborate and rather strong. Now, check again the utility of the property, the zoning, and make sure that the local ordinance don't prohibit certain of these things. Again, one other kind of tiny home, or rather small home, is the ones they use out of containers. There's been a lot of creative designs made with these containers that you can buy. I personally don't like them. They're made out of metal and they're just kind of awkward to work with as far as the construction material, but they do make a good temporary type of structure. You make a cabin out of them or something, or maybe you can make a storage unit or maybe a garden shed or something like that. As far as a house, I think there's better ways to build a temporary house rather than one of those containers. But that's just my opinion. Um, you want to also address the operating costs of your household, the maintenance, and so on, and whether you can use it as an utility place that offsets some of your costs. You treat it like a business, for example. You're trying to be as frugal and economic as possible when you have your little household. And these are ideas for people who want to have a cabin or something. And there's a lot of people who like that. Maybe that's just a temporary place they go for the holidays. They want to camp or have a little piece of land near a state park or something. So you can buy a piece of land like that. Let's say you got something for $25,000, and let's say you got lucky, you got 2 acres for $25,000. 2 acres is a fairly big piece of land, and it might have different kinds of terrain on it, a little bit of variation. And if it has a clearing in it, you can put your something there and really make it a great campsite for years and years. And then as you go along, if you have a strategy where, let's say you get what they call a base camp almost. You just get your little piece of land and put your little cabin there or your yurt or whatever, and then you use the summer vacation place and your guests, and you can rent it out from temporary for for a Airbnb or something like that. And then over the years, that particular investment that you made, the $25,000 of land, and maybe the area around it has slightly gotten more improved, and then next thing you know, you have a nice building lot sitting there that you can sell for a profit, perhaps. So there's a lot of angles about trying to get low-cost housing, kind of getting your foot in the door with some kind of residence of some kind. I mean, if you really want to be rustic and you're really just young and fit and everything, you can get yourself a piece of land, put your yurt there or your cabin or whatever, your hut or your tent, and just live there as long as you can. I mean, it's not for everybody, but some people can do it, especially now that you see people in these big cities sleeping on the streets. And hey, there's a lot of land out in the countryside. Is a lot nicer than sleeping on the street. If you're going to sleep in a tent, why not you maybe go sleep in the countryside where at least it's a lot more pleasant. So I make a little humor about this, but actually it's a very serious situation when you have housing that is way too expensive for young people to buy, and there's a lot of alternatives now. People are looking into how can we make housing in general a less costly part of our life, because I've known people who are like house poor. You get a nice house, they got a house, but they don't have any extra money because all the money that they had is in the mortgage and the interest and all the maintenance and insurance, and you have a house, but you're not really enjoying it fully. So I suggest starting small. If you're a first-time buyer, look into some of these alternatives about lower costing housing. Again, the taxes are lower in the rural areas, so generally speaking, if you want a lower cost lifestyle in living arrangements, then it's generally going to be out in the countryside. So I hope I've helped some people get a little clarity on low-cost housing and general buying and selling real estate in Virginia. And please see some of my other content and like and share if you enjoy the content. Thanks.